as we go through, any big questions we can answer towards the end. And then we'll open up the chat throughout to get some feedback from you all tonight. And we are recording this on YouTube. So we're going to start recording that. All right. So what is wrong with this water tonight? We have Kevin Guadalupe on. He's our endemic species biologist for Southern Nevada. My name's Abby Zarnecki. I am the angler and aquatic educator for Southern Nevada. And then we have Jess Brooks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jess Brooks. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I am the Wildlife Education Coordinator for ENDO in the Southern region.
And then we also have Michelle Lopez.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I am the AmeriCorps Wildlife Educator for the Las Vegas Southern region.
All right, so here's one of our waters. This is an example of a water that has kind of kicked out some of the native species and now is overtaken with aquarium fish. So that's where we're kind of talking about tonight, is all these, a few of our species. Kevin's going to dive deep into all of that and how we can help get, save our native species and what we can do with those aquarium fish. So like I said, Kevin's going to get started. He'll talk about the native waters and backgrounds for all of our efforts. Then we're going to go over some native fish species and spotlight them. Then we're going to go into what is an invasive species, some of the aquarium fish that we're dealing with, and some case studies and how they all coincide, and what efforts you can do just as a resident of Nevada, and answer some more questions. So on to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Abby. Again, my name is Kevin Guadalupe. I work for the Nevada Department of Wildlife here in the Southern region, and I'm an endemic aquatics biologist, but mostly work on native fish here in Southern Nevada. And so if you're not familiar with NDOW, we are split into 3 regions. They showed up for a second there. But today I'm primarily going to talk about the Southern region area here, which is primarily the area that I work in. So our Southern region is composed of these north and south running basins. It's often referred to as the basin and range area. And the ecosystems in this area are the Mojave, the Great Basin, and we also have species of the Colorado River Basin. I'm going to move it forward. Still learning how to do this remote control stuff. Next slide, Abby. So a lot of the land here is composed of these 4 counties. And some of you may or may not know that a lot of our land is federally managed land. A lot of it here in the yellow, as you can see, is BLM land. We have green land here is Forest Service. We have national parks in the orange. And this purple right here is the National Testing and Training Range. And if you notice, I want to also draw attention to these very thin slices of clear land like Las Vegas and some of these other areas, and that's all the private land. Next slide. Which closely aligns with a lot of our private waters. So like I said, much of our land, about 90% of it, is federally managed, but a lot of our water resources are privately owned. So to conserve any of the species, you need to have a very good relationship with a lot of our private landowners. And our springs also, and our water systems here, our perennial waters are different from other ones around the West. And if you think of a cool mountain stream that may be running from snowmelt, a lot of our waters down here come from the ground about 90 degrees Fahrenheit or very warm thermal springs, and they gradually cool as they go downstream. So many of the species that live here are very well adapted to very hot, very warm waters. And so a lot of the fish live in these springs and a lot of the other aquatic species. Next slide. So to talk a little about the conservation history of this, I'll tell you a story about two areas of southern Nevada in Nye County, Beatty and Ash Meadows, which so next slide. Let's see. In the 1940s and 1950s, the National Testing and Training Range was used as a gunnery range for World War II practice and other things like, next slide, or next, let me forward it, nuclear weapons. Next, secretive aircraft. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, after the baby boom and people were exploring more places to build homes, Ash Meadows with its running waters seemed like a great place to build. And there was exploration in this area, and many of the people started to see some of these species disappear, particularly at Devil's Hole, where the water started to go down. This other species here, the Pahrump poolfish, next slide. Go back one. Okay, so these 4 species of poolfish that occurred here in the Pahrump Valley, some of them started to go extinct by groundwater exploration, introduction of non-native species, including goldfish. And much of this history you could read about in this great book here called Battle Against Extinction. It goes over much of the history. Some people really wanted to save these species, and some people saw them as a burden to economic growth in the area. And there was really no laws at the time to tell you what you could and couldn't do. So the group of scientists that got together, that many of them wrote this book, formed the Desert Fishes Council, and this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it ruled in favor of keeping the water in Devil's Hole in particular above the spawning shelf. Here's Olin, one of the biologists that works out there, working on finding eggs here. Next, advance it a little. So through their conservation efforts, next, the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. One UNLV professor, James Deacon, who wrote this book, he collected about 28 of these individual Empitrichthyes lados, now a de facto monotypic genus because of the extinction in the other species. But the poolfish are currently extirpated or gone from Nye County. But good news, and this is a side note, is we are exploring some private ponds in those areas around Beatty to maybe potentially start some new refuge ponds. But they occur in 3 primary areas across the state. Next. But we also, part of this other part of the story is our 4 state protected amphibians. And Beatty ties closely into this, and that the Amargosa toad was petitioned twice to list as under the Endangered Species Act, but due to conservation agreements and partnerships, especially due to efforts of local landowners, improving the habitat on their areas and really taking the toad conservation serious, it was not deemed needed for listing under the Endangered Species Act. We also have conservation agreements and strategies for the Columbia spotted frog, which is also multi-state and multi-agency, which is currently going on. And for the Relic leopard frog, which was also petitioned, but due to local conservation efforts, was also determined not needed listing status. Next. Or precluded from it. But currently we still have other petitions going on, and one of those is for the Arizona toad, which occurs in much of the southeast part of our state. Next, advance. Also a petition to list over 42 spring snails, go back, and 42 spring snails throughout and many of these are endemic to single sources in these springs, in springs that flow no more than a few feet. Next. But again, primarily I work on these fish in these regions, and this is a dubious title, but Nevada has 26 listed species, federally listed species here, which is the most of any state. And I'm not, bragging about that number, but it kind of shows you the small limited range of these species, but it's also a very limited number of people that are working on this. So just in this area, not including Colorado River, there's 14 listed fish species, and 3 of these are the only member of their genus. And those were the prump poolfish because of the other relatives in its family, in its genus went extinct, the Moapidace and the wombfin. And next slide. But I'm going to talk a little about one of these fish species just to highlight some more. At Ash Meadows, so we have the Devil's Hole pupfish that occurs just outside of Ash Meadows, but there are actually 2 other pupfish that are endangered that occur primarily. So yeah, the Warm Springs area, which is getting highlighted by Abby right here, is the entire range of that species that occurs in about 5 of these springs in an area that's no bigger than a couple football fields, and is a very low flowing system. Next. And also Michelle will talk a little about the Ash Meadows Amargosa pupfish coming up. So to help conserve some of these, through public land sales or the Southern Nevada Public Land Management Act, there was funding that received between this 2008 and 2015 to get rid of crayfish that were threatening these springs. And so what they did is they buried the springs that had crayfish and desiccated them and piped out the water. Next slide. They created fences between the springs that had crayfish and the ones that didn't. Next slide. And they piped the water about 2 miles off into the desert and drained the spring for about a year. Next. And kept the entire species in just these small tanks. That's how limited some of the population was in this. These are mainly, this was done by Fish and Wildlife Service refuge systems, but also had partnership with Nevada Department of Wildlife as well. Next. Here's a EDNA study that tested if the crayfish were gone from the system after desiccation. Next slide. But at the Nevada Department of Wildlife, my primary task was knowing what the population was doing before and after these restorations. So we assisted with a lot of the work out there, including because these systems are such low flow systems, we had to create these small traps just to survey this. Next. And this is a 3-pass removal population estimate that we would do out there. Next slide. And these are the kind of figures and estimates that we run. And so to tell you, not to go into too much detail about this, but the numbers after crayfish were gone and the springs were opened up, the population was increased and we were successful in getting crayfish out. And this is the kind of data that we collect as fishery biologists for Nevada Department of Wildlife for our federal partners. Next. Okay, so that's it on my part. And Michelle will talk to you about the Ash Meadows Amargosa pupfish, which occurs in the larger systems out there at Ash Meadows.
Yeah, so the Ash Meadows Amargosa pupfish do have a limited habitat and they're endemic to Ash Meadows, which means they're found here on this one place and haven't been found anywhere else on Earth. These pupfish live in water up to 92 degrees Fahrenheit and can survive in water just a ½ inch deep. Most other fish species wouldn't be able to survive in these conditions, which is part of the reason why it makes it so unique and interesting. So this video is in Big Spring, and you can see that these small chunky fish are a little bit over 2 inches long. They usually have several indistinct vertical stripes on them. And the females and the young fish are this olive green to tan color, while the males have more of a bluish tint, which becomes more vibrant during spawning. And these guys are pretty territorial, especially when it comes to feeding and those breeding areas. They live in about 8 spring areas within Ash Meadows, all of which are designated as critical habitat. And the water they live in is basically a prehistoric ocean from 12,000 years ago and is sometimes called fossil water. Ash Meadows used to be covered in water, but over time it started drying out and the water levels started decreasing to what's left of it now, small scattered pockets of water. And Ash Meadows is believed to have the greatest concentration of endemic life in the United States. They are a threatened species, but in 2017, a restoration project was completed that restored 2,000 feet of stream channel, replaced the culvert, and removed non-native species. This allowed for long-term conservation for the Ash Meadows Amargosa pupfish, and they've seen an increase in their population since then.
you, Michelle. So then I'm going to go over some Pahrump poolfish. So Kevin introduced those, and they are endangered right now. There are many efforts to hopefully be able to get them off the list. So again, they're another small fish. They're only 2 inches, about 2 inches. There will be some video coming up from their efforts that Kevin and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have been working at the Nevada State Parks with their restoration efforts. They only live about 3 years long. So this is one of those species and one of those things where you learn about certain fish, certain species where it's hard for them to reproduce because of their size or to survive, especially when something not native to their area is introduced. So they again live in natural springs. Their habitat, the waters that they like to live in, are about 76 degrees, very specific. They eat any little plant and animal matter materials. And because of their size and length, again, their survivability is very tough, mainly because crayfish feed off the bottom where they're laying their eggs and they eat them. Again, same with the mosquito fish. And also the crayfish are so much bigger than some of the Pahrump poolfish, even at full size, that they just can't survive. So we're gonna play this video.
We're salvaging the Pahrump poolfish out of Spring Mountain Ranch State Park. This was the largest population of fish for a long period of time, but recently we've run into troubles with invasive species here.
At times it's been between 10,000 or even up to 30,000 fish. And within the last few years, I think in 2012, we found crayfish here. And then this past year, we found mosquito fish. And recent surveys have shown that the population is probably under 1,000 fish here, and that we think that if left in here, that we would lose this population if we didn't do something.
Our role is to collect population monitoring information, conduct small-scale habitat restoration, and also to provide technical assistance for recovery of these species. It's only found here in southern Nevada, nowhere else in the world. It has existed here anywhere from 10,000 to 13,000 years, and it's evolved to live in a very extreme, small environment. And that's pretty remarkable for a species to do that and to survive for that long.
The Pahrump poolfish was originally found in one spring in the Pahrump area. They're a small fish. They're about 2 to 3 inches in size.
Pahrump poolfish lived in a habitat that was a near constant 75 degrees and flowed consistently year-round. Below 75 degrees, the poolfish.
I'm sorry.
Go into a hibernative state, and so they will actually just lay there on the bottom, and that's when they're more susceptible to invasive species eating them. So the invasive species eat the eggs, they eat the smaller fish, and they can eat the adults. They also eat the food that the larger fish rely on.
In the 1960s, the Pahrump poolfish was listed under the Endangered Species Preservation Act. In 1980, the Fish and Wildlife Service officially came out with a recovery plan, which set measurable goals and objectives to address the threats to the species. The Nevada Department of Wildlife is probably one of our strongest partners. When it comes to Pahrump poolfish, they're an endangered species, but they're also state protected, so we share a lot of common goals in trying to preserve this species.
Having partnerships are amazing. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service provides us with our data and our expertise. They're also great at maintaining databases for us, and they're great assistants in the field as well. So far, we've salvaged 162 individuals after a weeks-long salvaging effort.
We're at the Lake Mead Fish Hatchery, owned and operated by the Nevada Department of Wildlife. We kind of made a decision that instead of risk losing that population to non-native fish, that we'd bring them here and try to maintain the populations and its genetics. So we brought them here, we have a makeshift tank set up for them, and so we're going to hold them here and hopefully try to propagate them while we're restoring Lake Harriet and getting rid of non-native fish.
The biggest thing people can do to help the Pahrump poolfish is just, kind of recognize the areas that have been set aside for them and look at alternatives instead of dumping a pet or clearing out your backyard pond and releasing them somewhere.
The last thing you want to do is introduce it back into an environment that it's not meant to be in.
The end goal is that we would release pearl poolfish back into Spring Mountain Ranch State Park. I mean, it's been a great refuge for them that once we can remove non-native species from there, they would do well again.
It's been extremely damaging for the state of Nevada and for maintaining these sites that people like to enjoy, and fish species that are extremely rare heritage to southern Nevada. And if we get rid of these habitats or get rid of these species, we may not know what we lose in the future.
All right, so that kind of sums up the prompt poolfish and a lot of efforts that Kevin and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are having to work with. On this chart, you can see a nice little average number, and then all of a sudden it's just dropping off in the last few years. So unfortunately, we were looking at over 10 to like 30,000, like they were saying in the video, of prompt poolfish. And then now we are looking at only about 4,997, and that's in all the efforts. So in one area alone, they were able to have 10,000, and now in all the populations or all the waters, we're only looking at less than 5,000. All right, on to Jess.
Abby, so good news
Okay.
is in 2020 we reestablished Spring Mountain Ranch State Park, and that was that orange that you showed there. Go back. Yeah, so that large orange area was the contribution of Spring Mountain Ranch. So that one was restarted in 2000, and we haven't seen any non-native fish back there since. So the population should go up in the next year estimate.
That'll be awesome. Thank you. All right.
All right. Make sure I have control here. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to be chatting with everyone tonight about the Relic leopard frog. It is currently listed as vulnerable, and it is a state protected species in Nevada. It was originally discovered in 1875 along the Virgin River in Utah. At one time, they were thought to be extinct, but was rediscovered in 1991 through a genetic study. Historically, the relic leopard frogs were known to occur in about 24 sites through Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. In the 1990s, however, there were only 7 native population sites documented, only 5 of which still remain today. Current main native habitat areas include Lake Mead National Park and Rogers Springs. The rest of the current populations of relic leopard frogs are introductions and are still being studied. The main introduced population right now is at the Springs Preserve. As far as their habitat goes, relic leopard frogs are habitat generalists, meaning that they can live in a variety of landscapes, including streams, springs, wetlands, very similar places. They really prefer running water, though. As far as threats go, there are lots of threats, one of which is habitat changes due to dams, water development, agriculture, urban development. Remaining leopard frog populations suffer from low genetic variation since known population groups are known to be so small. They can also have population fragmentation, and they're pretty small little frogs to begin with, too. And they also have the threat of being isolated from their, isolation of their remaining habitat that we still have. Invasive species like invasive plants, burrows, bullfrogs, exotic fish released by their owners, even crayfish, like what Kevin was talking about in the previous video. Their suitable habitat is threatened by potential water developments, as I kind of already discussed, also human visitors to their habitat areas, and disease. Because they're dangerously low population and all of these multiple threats, we're closely monitoring their known populations. On this slide, I really wanted to show keeping a quote. It says, "Keeping species alive is part of keeping the ecosystem intact." This quote is in reference to specifically the relic leopard frog, but it really encompasses the idea behind all native species. Our goal is to maintain a healthy ecosystem, and that includes all the diversity and the endemic species living there. So before we jump into some of the invasive species that we do have, I wanted to share with everyone what is invasive, what it means. So invasive means that it is a species that can develop widespread populations with little stopping them. When introduced into local ecosystems, they develop abundant, widespread populations that negatively impact the environment, the economy, human health, or the way we live. They can have negative impacts on the environment. The introduced species becomes invasive when they cause negative impacts on the environment and for the species already living in that area. These invasives originally developed in their native environment, and that's the environment that they're used to surviving in. So in their new environments that they're introduced into, they're typically very different. These new habitats are very different, and there are very little, if any, threats or predators that can keep their population in check or keep them at a healthy level. They sort of have a one-up on all the species in this new environment and can easily outcompete native species for basic survival needs like food, water, shelter, and space. It's important to remember that these native species are also endemic, meaning they only live or only occur in that area and might already be struggling to survive or might already be endangered. It's also important that ditching your pet in some of these examples that we're going to talk about later in the wild is very unethical and even humane because of the problems they can cause to the species already living there, like a few that we've already talked about, or they can struggle themselves and they may not even survive. So ditching your pet in the wild is also illegal. It's just one more thing to think about. So we are going to talk to you a little bit about some of the invasive species. There are multiple aquarium fish species. I'm not just going to cover one species, but rather a few. So we're going to just cover aquarium fish in general. So there is some problem species. There are goldfish, guppies, you know, basically anything that you could have in an aquarium fish, cichlids, things like that. The aquarium trade has been huge. The aquarium trade in general means that fish are traded across borders. Fish are raised within an aquarium or within a pet store, within a pet shop, sold to someone, and then they no longer have the means to care for that animal. So the aquarium trade in and of itself has caused numerous species to be released to the wild when the owners don't really have any way to take care of them. Oh, I lost control. Never mind. I got it back. So what happens when we dump aquarium fish to the native species? Aquarium fish in general sort of live in this very perfect habitat that we create for them when they're in a tank. What happens when we release them is they're placed in this new environment where they don't have very many predators, if at all, and they have sort of everything at their fingertips. It's like a giant tank. So they have no problem surviving. All of the other endemic native species that are there are easily they're easily there for them to eat for food. They can eat eggs. They can decimate the habitat. They can eat all the vegetation. And as far as research goes, we're always doing research. We're always looking at all the urban ponds in town. We're always looking at some of the very specific state study areas that Kevin and Abby and Michelle have already talked about. And it's just going to be ongoing forever. It's never going to stop. But part of the reason why we're having this conversation with all of you tonight and the audience is to bring up this idea of rehoming your aquarium fish to either someone who can take care of it or back to the pet store, take care of it yourself, or maybe even educate others. It's just another thought to think twice before purchasing an aquarium fish. So another invasive species is Redeared Sliders. There is some pet trade going on with this one as well, but Redeared Sliders, and there are two pictures here. This picture up here on the very top, this is what the Redeared Sliders are known for, is that red marking near the eye. They are, in fact, a problem species. They have been introduced into many areas of the United States outside of their native range, very similar to aquarium fish, as well as other countries, and are listed as one of the world's worst 100 invasive species. So they are a particular problem species. As far as their habitat goes, Redeared Sliders occupy a variety of natural freshwater habitats, streams, rivers, ponds, lakes, swamps, marshes even. They can also be found in man-made habitats such as ditches, canals, urban lakes and ponds like Sunset Park here in the southern region. Redeared Sliders are often found in close proximity to urban areas due to higher incidence of pet releases. So pet releases can be accidental or they can be on purpose. Accidental releases can't really happen with aquarium fish. That's why I didn't mention it. But with Redeared Sliders, they can actually escape and find their way to man-made ditches, canals, or even urban ponds, like Sunset Park was my example there. As far as impacts go, introduced Redeared Sliders compete with native species for food and habitat. Here in the West, meaning the whole West Coast, including Nevada, Arizona, California, Washington, and Oregon, sliders compete with native Western pond turtles for food, egg-laying sites, and basking sites. And one of the other pictures I have up here, this one, shows just how competitive these basking sites can be. These are all Redeared Sliders, and they're in this picture sort of trampling on top of each other just to get a good basking site. And this is not uncommon to see. Redeared Sliders are also vectors of disease and can transmit parasites to native animal species found in this new habitat they're introduced in. Introduced populations can expand rapidly, with female Redeared Sliders able to lay up to 6 clutches of eggs per year, each containing up to 30 eggs. So they reproduce like crazy and they have no problem outcompeting endemic and native species. One more native species that I'll chat with you about tonight is crayfish. So there are multiple species found in Nevada, none of which are native in all of Nevada. How do they spread? They are spread by inexperienced and uncareful anglers. So if you are an angler, it's just one more reason to be careful, be educated, and be responsible. Or people who buy them as pets and release them into the wild. It's actually really common for teachers to get crayfish for their classrooms and then not know what to do with them come summer. So they'll release them into the wild thinking that it's a good thing, but in fact, it's a terrible thing to do. And as far as their habitat goes, crayfish can inhabit lakes, streams, and ponds, but they prefer areas that have rock slogs and other debris for some sort of added cover. The substrate at the bottom of these waters can be clay, silt, sand, gravel, or rock. Some crayfish can dig burrows at the bottom of the lakes or ponds to escape waters that are drying up or becoming inhospitable, but they can reemerge later. So this sort of echoes what Kevin was speaking of earlier when they were working on Lake Harriet. When they drained that, when they drained Lake Harriet, they had to keep that area completely drained for 12 months to make sure that crayfish couldn't come back, because they can in fact burrow underneath the ground and sort of wait for that water to come back. So there are a lot of impacts with this invasive species. Infestation is the very first one. It's not necessary to introduce both male and female crayfish to begin a new population or infestation. One female can hold viable sperm for a very long period of time. They can begin a new population if they were released into a suitable environment. Crayfish basically eat everything. They are considered opportunistic feeders for this reason. They eat aquatic plants, aquatic invertebrates, snails, leeches, worms, clams, insects, even crustaceans, fish eggs, small fish, or adult fish, depending on how big the fish are, even dead or decaying plants, dead or decaying animals, and fungi. They're especially known for the destruction of the bottom layer or the substrate of said habitat. So displacement of native species in the habitat are also sort of known for, such as the prompt poolfish that Kevin was speaking of, an endangered native fish so the prompt poolfish is an endangered native fish that only reaches about 2 inches as an adult. So this is perfect food for the crayfish. As far as a specific location for this case study, in Warm Springs Complex and the Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, for example, the waters had to be drained for 1 whole year. All right, on to Miss Abby.
All right, there we go. So this is one of my favorite examples of biodiversity being lost to an invasive species. It's pretty much the only thing I've been able to show the public that really lays it out there for you. So you can see tons of different fish species. This happens in many of our waters. Naturally, there's tons of different species. And then one little green fish, maybe two, get introduced. But like Jess was saying, they can carry their eggs with them for a moment. And sometimes it only takes one. And now they have actually overcompeted and taken out this waterway from all these other species. So it actually created a die-off of all these multiple species that were naturally meant to be here because someone released a fish into the water. Or with those fish or the aquarium, like even just dumping the water into another water, these snails that aren't meant to be here can actually take out some of the food that these fish need to survive. Plants, it also pushes out the natural food and changes it to more of a weedy aquatic plant that necessarily isn't a good food source for the fish that were supposed to be there. So it actually creates a starvation too. So just keep that in mind also. There we go. So this is from the Sea Grant for Illinois and Indiana, and they also have a lot of efforts out there to plan for the future, especially it is almost Christmas time for the holidays where we're gifting animals. People do not realize how long a goldfish might be able to live, up to 10 years here. And that red-eared slider that was really cute and little in the pet store can actually live up to 20 years. And now what are you going to do with it? Unfortunately, please don't release it into our native waters. The natural fish will not be able to survive with them. One thing we didn't get to show, I don't think, in this presentation is that these goldfish that start out at only an inch or two can actually get as big as a football. So if you like put your hands up and imagine holding a football, they can really get that big. Just they can get as big as a carp or a koi that you see. It might actually even be a goldfish. They've actually taken out some waters here too, and we've been given pictures of goldfish blankets. And it just looks like the shimmering gold blanket in the water, and it's just so many goldfish that have taken over that water. So now Michelle's turn on how we can help.
Thank you. So most pets released to the wild don't survive, and many of them end up suffering before they die. And pets are usually unable to find food or shelter in the wild, and they're often an easy meal for another animal. And if it does manage to survive, like Abby just mentioned, your pet probably could become an invasive species that many of the native wildlife may not have the defenses to compete against. And invasive species cause harm to the environment and the economy. So you can help us out by supporting Don't Ditch a Fish and the Don't Let It Loose program. And if you do need to rehome your pet or another animal, keep these options in mind. You could give your fish to pet shops. Some of them might even be able to pay you for your pet. You can try reselling it or regifting it to somebody like offices, schools, or clubs. Most of them would be happy to take it in for you. And if needed, a vet can help you humanely euthanize the animal. Would you mind going to the next slide for me, Abby? Thank you. So we are in the process of rolling out a program called Don't Ditch a Fish. And ultimately, the goal of this plan is to stop the illegal introduction of non-native aquarium fish and other invasive species in Nevada's waters where endemic fishes can be found, basically to get people to stop ditching their fish. The purpose of it is to educate pet owners on why they shouldn't try to set their pets free when they don't want it anymore, because as we've learned, they can really hurt our ecosystems and fragile habitats. It's very costly to restore these environments, and most of the time, they've only really been successful at getting rid of those invasive species whenever they completely drain a lake and then start over. And on top of that, it is illegal. So the main thing to take away from this program is to not release your aquatic pets or plants into the wild. And the next one, please. So it's really important to do your research and know what you're getting yourself into, and the employees at the fish and pet shops will help you make sure you can properly take care of your fish. Because they're having those case studies, like Abby just mentioned, where a goldfish can grow up to the size of the football and really hurt the rest of the animals in that body of water. And the next one. So Don't Let It Loose is another great program that's similar to Don't Ditch a Fish, and most of Nevada's independent pet stores are part of the Don't Let It Loose community. They have resources for other animals too, like birds, reptiles, amphibians, and exotic pets. And this website lists all the pet shops in Vegas, Reno, and Winnemucca that are part of the program. And the next slide shows a bunch of stores that support the program. And when you purchase a fish from these stores, they'll provide you information on the program and why it's really important not to release your fish into the wild. And if you decide that you no longer want it, most of them will actually be able to take your fish in. And in the case that they're unable to do so, they'll provide you with advice on other options. And a big way to help is just to spread the knowledge that you've learned. If you or anyone you know is planning on getting a fish or even getting rid of a fish, let them know it's illegal to try to set it free, and offer some suggestions for where to purchase one and what to do if they don't end up wanting it anymore. And back to you, Abby.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for our amazing co-hosts today. Here are mine and Jess's emails. You can email us anytime. Any questions for Kevin or Michelle, we can forward for you as well. Thank you so much for attending tonight. Really excited to have Kevin on with us. And we do have a survey as you exit. If you can fill that out, let us know how we did, what you'd like to see next time. And we do plan on having more to this series. So we're going to talk about more of these sensitive spring fish and aquatic species that are endemic and native to our area and Nevada, and why and how, and all the questions that most people don't get to find out about. So when you go out and about and you're enjoying the aquatic environments, please recreate responsibly and be a responsible recreator. So thank you all for coming tonight. And if you have any more questions, please let us know. We'll leave the chat and the Q&A box open for a little while.